January 2nd, 1777. The American Revolution was on life support. George Washington's exhausted army was pinned against the frozen Delaware River, completely trapped. On the other side of a small, muddy creek called the Assunpink, a massive British force under General Charles Cornwallis was getting ready to deliver the final blow at dawn. For the Americans, there was no retreat. Surrender meant the end of everything they were fighting for. A string of brutal defeats in New York had crushed their morale. The army standing with Washington wasn't anything like its former self. It had shrunk to just a few thousand starving, freezing men, and most of their enlistments were about to expire. The revolution wasn't just losing, it was dying. But Washington, backed into a corner with nothing left to lose, had one last, desperate trick up his sleeve. It was a silent nighttime gamble so insane that no one, least of all the British, would ever see it coming. Inside Washington's headquarters, things were grim. His officers knew their position was a death trap. General Cornwallis, a famously aggressive commander, had boasted he had the old fox right where he wanted him and would bag him in the morning. The British army settled in for the night, totally confident the rebels had nowhere to go. They could see the American campfires burning across the creek and hear what sounded like men digging in for the big fight. Everything looked exactly as it should. But it was all a ruse. As night fell, Washington gathered his officers and laid out a plan born of pure desperation. They wouldn't fight, and they wouldn't surrender. They would just disappear. He would leave a skeleton crew of about 500 men behind to keep the fires blazing all night long. These men had one job: make a ton of noise. They clanged pots, swung pickaxes into the frozen dirt, and talked loudly to create the illusion that the whole army was still there, getting ready for the morning's battle. They were a ghost army, a phantom force meant to distract 8,000 British and Hessian soldiers. Meanwhile, the main force began a silent march into the darkness. It was an incredible risk. Their route was a mess of muddy, unmarked backroads, and they had to be perfectly quiet. Washington gave a critical order: wrap every cannon wheel in thick cloth to muffle the rumbling of the artillery. Absolute silence was demanded from the men. The entire revolution now depended on them slipping away, unheard and unseen, from right under the nose of the British. Escaping the trap at Trenton was only half the battle. Now, they had to survive the march. The 12-mile journey to Princeton was an absolute nightmare. The back road Washington chose was a stump-ridden track that had frozen into a treacherous, rutted mess. For an army already on the brink of collapse from exhaustion and hunger, it was a brutal test of sheer will. Many of Washington's soldiers were walking scarecrows. Their uniforms were in tatters and their boots were worn through. Hundreds of men didn't even have shoes, and their feet were wrapped in rags that left a trail of bloody footprints on the frozen ground. The cold was so bitter it cut right through their thin coats, forcing the men to huddle together as they stumbled through the dark. And they had to be quiet. Every snapped twig could give them away. Officers moved up and down the line, whispering orders and encouragement. The muffled cannon wheels worked like a charm, keeping the army's heaviest equipment from betraying their position. This was a race against the sun. Washington knew he had to hit the British garrison at Princeton before Cornwallis woke up, found an empty camp, and realized he'd been tricked. All through the night, the column pushed on, driven by nothing more than their commander's will and the faint hope of a victory that could turn this whole war around. With every agonizing step, they moved deeper behind enemy lines, gambling that their audacity would pay off with the element of surprise. As the sky began to lighten, the sleepy town of Princeton was just a few miles away. The race was almost over. As dawn broke on January 3, 1777, the first American troops reached Princeton. They had almost done it. But the British commander at Princeton, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood, had just received orders to march his troops to Trenton to join Cornwallis for the big attack. As Mahood led his regiments out of town, he looked across the frozen fields and saw them, the front of Washington's army. The surprise wasn't quite total. For a moment, both sides were completely shocked to see each other. Washington immediately ordered a detachment under his friend, General Hugh Mercer, to cut off the British and destroy a bridge to stop Cornwallis from sending help. Mercer's 350 men charged into an orchard and slammed right into Mahood's professional soldiers. The fight was instant and vicious. The Americans fired first, but the British were veterans. Mercer's men were quickly overwhelmed by a disciplined bayonet charge. Mercer himself was surrounded. The British thought he was Washington and demanded he surrender. He refused, drew his sword, and fought until he was bayoneted 7 times and left for dead. With Mercer down, his men broke and ran. The American line was collapsing. But just when the battle seemed lost, George Washington himself rode onto the field. On his white horse, he galloped straight toward the fighting, rallying the terrified militia. He rode to within 30 yards of the British line, totally exposed to their fire, and shouted, "Parade with us, my brave fellows! There is but a handful of the enemy, and we shall have them directly." His unbelievable courage was electric. The wavering American troops steadied themselves, reformed their lines, and with Washington leading the charge, they surged forward. A massive volley of gunfire erupted, and for a terrifying moment, Washington vanished in a cloud of black smoke. When it cleared, he was still there, unharmed, pushing his men onward. That was the turning point. The British line, which had been seconds from victory, buckled. The sight of Washington's charge, combined with fire from other American units, was too much. The redcoats broke and ran. Washington, caught up in the moment, spurred his horse and chased after them, shouting, "It is a fine fox chase, my boys!" The rest of the British soldiers fled back into Princeton and barricaded themselves in the largest building in town, Nassau Hall, at what is now Princeton University. And here, a young artillery captain named Alexander Hamilton, who had been denied admission to the college years earlier, got his revenge. He aimed his cannons at the building, and after a few cannonballs tore through the walls, the British surrendered. The Battle of Princeton was over in less than an hour. The victory was incredible, but Washington's army was spent. The night march and the sharp, brutal fight had drained their last ounces of energy. Washington knew that Cornwallis, furious at being duped in Trenton, would be racing down the road to Princeton with his main army. That was a fight the Americans couldn't win. So instead of pushing on to capture the main British supply depot at New Brunswick, Washington made the smart call to withdraw. He led his exhausted but victorious army north to the highlands of New Jersey, where they finally set up a secure winter camp in Morristown. The casualties showed just how decisive the fight had been. The Americans suffered about 44 men killed and wounded, while the British had around 500 total casualties, with nearly 300 of those taken prisoner. The impact was immediate. Cornwallis, completely humiliated and with his supply lines threatened, had to abandon his posts across New Jersey. He pulled his forces back toward New Brunswick, giving most of the state back to the Patriots. The 10 crucial days, from the famous crossing of the Delaware to the victory at Princeton, were over. In just over a week, Washington had attacked the enemy 3 times, won 3 times, and completely flipped the momentum of the war. The Battle of Princeton wasn't just a military win, it was a psychological resurrection. The victories at Trenton and Princeton sent a jolt of electricity through the American colonies. Faith in the Army and in Washington's leadership, which had been dangerously low, came roaring back. News of the victories inspired soldiers to re-enlist and convinced new recruits that the cause wasn't hopeless. It also sent a powerful signal across the Atlantic, especially to potential allies like France, that the American fight for independence was far from over. The sneak attack, born from the absolute depths of desperation, didn't just save an army from being wiped out, it saved the American Revolution itself. On the frozen fields of Princeton, a band of exhausted rebels gave their new nation a fighting chance. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing for more stories about the moments that shaped our world. And let us know in the comments what other battles of the Revolution you'd like to see covered. Thanks for watching.